every semester, the CPR directors meet to talk about the theme of the the health outcome seminars, and the theme of this semester is insights into research in industry and consulting, and we identified some key opinion leaders and people that we wanted to contact about this, and one of the people that came foremost to mind was a former student and an alum of our program, Caitlyn Solem. Sorry, Caitlyn.
I was Wilkie.
Yes. So, yes, we're delighted that Caitlyn accepted our invitation, and so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Caitlyn's career. And I don't know, I'm thankful that none of you were here when Caitlyn was a graduate student.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good news. Caitlyn completed her master's in 2007, and 2007, yeah, and then started a fellowship with Novo Nordisk in partnership with UIC, and that was a one-of-a-kind fellowship, and she worked with Todd and I on both her master's and her PhD, and one focused more on health economics and health outcomes, another was a bit more pharmacoepi focused. She graduated in 2010 with her PhD. She already had developed a strong relationship with people in industry and in consulting through her experience in her fellowship and her PhD. You became a member of the UIC group
I did after I was at Pharmerit, though.
After you were at Pharmerit, so are you a partner at Pharmerit now?
I am a principal, so I get to share the profits, so that's what matters, right?
Wow. Okay. So, Dr. Solem is head of the Patient-Reported Outcomes Center of Excellence at Pharmerit. You were like head of analytics.
Yeah, I was head of real-world evidence, but I was head of both last year, and then I decided to transition fully to patient-centered.
Okay, so as you can see, Caitlyn's got a lot of experience doing a lot of different things, and she's now part of the group that actually conceptualizes how the whole organization is run and organized, and I think that Caitlyn is here to share some of those insights into that. When we were talking, Edith and I talked with Caitlyn about what direction this talk could go, and to give her some insight into what we thought you guys were interested in. And so I hope that we've given some good insight into what you're interested in, and I'm sure that Caitlyn's going to do a great job. So please help me welcome her.
Thank you all. Just to kind of provide some orientation. So one, ask me any questions as you go. I'm happy to stop and go into a little bit more depth in any of the topics. What I'd like to do today is to provide you guys a little bit of an overview. So Simon's given a great introduction, but go a little bit deeper, and there may be pictures of myself and some of the pictures of my time here. Provide an overview of how my company, Pharmerit, we're a consulting company for the pharmaceutical industry, how we think about HEOR and how we've structured the different groups within Pharmerit to meet the needs of clients, mostly industry clients. And then provide a couple case studies to go a little bit deeper. So instead of just staying on the surface of, oh, here are the type of studies, show you how it actually works in practice. And really this is looking at from study design to the execution of that study, from that execution moving to make sure that it's something publishable, that it's interesting in the field, and then publication to implementation. So it really doesn't stop with the publication. You need to make sure that it's being shared with that audience. So a little bit about myself. So as Simon indicated, I was at UIC from 2005 to 2010. This is a picture of my first ribbon from an ISPOR conference. I believe that was in around 2007. Very, very fun time to get my master's. So when I completed it, my cohort, there were 3 of us master's students who started, and we all finished at the same time. It was wonderful to be able to celebrate that with them, as well as Margaret, who was probably was a PhD student here, really one of the best student mentors I could have had. As Simon indicated, I started a UIC and Novo Nordisk pre-doctoral fellowship, and this is where I developed some of those relationships. So you'll see in this picture here, that's Simon and Mark, who's actually a partner of Pharmerit. This was at ISPOR Dublin. This was a really wonderful night where I was able to really discover that Pharmerit was the place that I would want to be after graduation. Through my time at UIC, I would say one of the things that's most benefited my career is being able to be involved in the research initiatives of different professors, including Todd and Simon, in terms of looking at research priorities in COPD. In fact, the Delphi panel model that we use there is something that I've used more than once since then. So I completed my PhD in 2010. I've included the picture in the bottom right of me and my parents, who've been very supportive throughout this whole process. And then right after that, I was hired as a scientist at Pharmerit. I had a number of promotions almost annually to get to the point that I'm at now as an executive director and principal. But during that process, I've tried to be involved and continue to be involved with my UIC family. For those of you who go to ISPOR, I started judging the research competition right after I left left UIC, and I continue to, so I hope to see a strong team this year. I am trying to impartially be cheering for you guys. But you guys don't need my support. You guys have done a great job, especially in recent years. So at Pharmerit, I really had a number of different areas I focused on. At first, we were a smaller company, so I was doing a little bit of everything. But over time, even during my PhD, I love data. I love the analysis of data, the interpretation, and the presentation. So I started as this is covered. As we determined that we were going to have centers of excellence, so we were going to divide our company into 4 areas, I led the real-world evidence and data analytics group. So basically, if it involved stats analysis, I was leading those sort of efforts. And then I also started leading the patient-centered outcomes group. Just this year, starting January, I transitioned to focus on just the patient-reported outcomes. And I'm really excited to see where that goes. So I talked a little bit about Pharmerit. Some of you may be familiar with it. I'm assuming probably not so much. So I thought I'd provide our one slide that really summarizes our company. What we're trying to do as a company is to improve access to medical care through evidence generation worldwide. We've done this. We have a number of team members. We don't want to just do the same thing over and over again. We really try to invest in innovation. And that can be shown by these first 2 red boxes here. So we have over 30 years, in terms of our staff members, we have people with 30 years of experience in innovation, over 1,000 publications by people who work for Pharmerit. Currently, we're busy. We have over 300 projects for over 50 sponsors in the pharmaceutical companies. And we really try to make sure that, we feel that our biggest investment is in the culture and in the people in order to be able to really be scientists. And really, of course, we're a business, but we want to make sure that we're investing in people who have that passion and drive. We have, some people asked me this earlier, I think I estimated correctly, we have 142 experts in 8 offices worldwide. In the U.S., our biggest office is in Bethesda, which is where I'm from. But we also have, our main office in Europe is in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We have an office in Oxford, York, Berlin, and we just opened a Mumbai office. And also we have a presence in Shanghai. Okay, so now this is really getting into the meat of the talk. I wanted to share with you guys how Pharmerit has really taken the field of health economics and outcomes research and really tried to divide this into key core areas that we could focus on and say, this is what we do, and really kind of figure out which experts fit in which buckets. The first one is real-world evidence and data analytics, and really what we're looking at there is more the pharmacoepidemiology, doing costing studies, analyzing the data that exists, be that claims data, chart reviews, clinical trial analytics. All of that sort of analytic work falls in our real-world evidence center of excellence. Then to the right, we have the Patient-Reported Outcomes Clinical Outcomes Assessment Center of Excellence. We're trying to shorten that to patient-centered outcomes because too many words. And that's where we're looking at developing new measures as well as using existing measures for patient-reported outcomes. And that includes interactions with the FDA supporting our clients in showing the development and validation of these measures. We have modeling and meta-analysis. So these are the economic models that I'm sure you learned about in Suri's class. These are the ones where you're really building those Markov models, building the models that not only lead to publications, but then are used in the field in order to convince insurance companies to put drugs on formulary. And finally, strategic market access. This one stumped me for a while, I'll be honest, when I graduated. What strategic market access is doing is working with regulatory health technology assessment bodies in the US and worldwide, developing global value dossiers, different communication tools to make sure that that once a drug is approved, that the launch into the market exists. So going a little bit deeper in this, I know this is small, so I just want to kind of point out there are different tools. So a lot of the skills that you're learning result in different types of projects that go across the spectrum of drug development. So I'll focus on a few areas here that I wanted to share with you. So one thing that I think in school, I learned, when I was in graduate school, I learned a lot of different methods. But I think one thing I personally wasn't so sure of is how do those apply in the real world? So I wanted to share a little bit how I've seen that apply in the job or at Pharmerit. So in terms of in the phase 2 clinical trial type phase, so during the clinical trial phases, for strategic market access, one thing that we often do with clients is we try to help them determine what they should do. So some companies do have a really great grand plan. Other companies aren't so sure, and they want to make sure that they're doing the right studies at the right time to make sure that the right data is accessible. So we work with them to understand what is the landscape of the treatment, and then recommend, and sometimes they call it a matching gap analysis, recommend where are the gaps in the literature that need to be filled. Other areas that we might do, always literature reviews, there's qualitative stakeholder research. So instead of just doing the literature review, also going out and asking people who would be decision makers, well, what do you feel are the needs in this area, to help to further inform the market access and the plans. Now later on in the pipeline, in terms of strategic market access, we start to develop dossiers. So instead of just having a literature review, we're putting it in a structured format that can be used and accessed in different countries. We also do a lot of medical communications and publication support. So one thing we've found is that while a lot of companies hire medical writers for that are clinically focused, our field is different. People don't necessarily understand health economics, so we found that that's a really important need. In terms of modeling, these are the models that you always see. In an ideal situation, the first economic models are being developed based on literature reviews, based on the knowledge of the condition at a very early stage, sometimes even before the drug is in the phase 3 clinical trial. You've got an early model to kind of say, okay, here is what the field currently looks like. And then that can evolve as more data is available, so that by the time you get to market, you have that tool, you're confident in that tool, it's based on the literature, and you're able to adapt it to the different global markets. In the US, it's not about the comparative or the cost effectiveness model all the time, although ICER is changing that. It's really about the budget impact model. So what is the cost for this new therapy entering the market and shifting more patients to taking this medication versus another? So that typically you start developing in the, as the trial is starting to finish up, as you know the data readout is going to happen, and then it is refined as the drug comes to market, as pricing gets put in place. Then you put in those final deliverables and use that in your AMCP dossier, for example. One other thing that we do sometimes for modeling and meta-analysis is instead of having the inputs be based on just the data in the literature, we may do post hoc analyses of the trial data to make sure to kind of look at subpopulations, to understand what's going on there and build that into our model and try to go sometimes a bit more sophisticated than Markov states, or maybe even use the model as some of the source data for some of these transitions. These are all things that our modeling and meta-analysis group do. And of course, to inform these economic models, sometimes you don't need just the qualitative literature review. The meta-analytic piece is taking all that data, pulling it together, and determining those inputs. And sometimes that in and of itself is a deliverable separate from the economic model as well to understand the clinical condition. So as a drug is released to the market, then we end up taking that core cost effectiveness model and it's adapted to different regions. So the drug may be released in China, it may be released in Japan, or even in countries in Europe. So you've built this core, now you have to look for the country-specific inputs, and that's something our European office does a lot. So in terms of real-world evidence and data analytics, as I was saying, it's really about the data analysis, but in the best cases, we're able to affect the data before it is collected. So sometimes we work with clinical trial or companies that are developing clinical trials to make sure that we have those health economic inputs for as things that are being collected for the trial, so that we don't end up being a situation like, here's the data, we collected it, we didn't really need to collect health economics, but is there something you can do with this? Granted, that still happens, but in the best situations, we're also involved in the setup. And then one thing to realize is that sometimes it might be that we set something up, and then 3 or 4 or even 5 years go by, and that is when you're going to be analyzing that data. So it's kind of a long-term proposition there. In terms of types of data and designs that we use, we do medical chart review data. So we collect a little bit of data in-house at Pharmerit, but a lot, and I'll be giving an example of that later. But a lot of times we partner with a vendor. We design an analysis to meet some study objectives that the client has given us. And then we collect the data and analyze it on the back end across country, particularly when it's across countries, because every country has its own system, and if you try to use databases that exist, they may collect things in different ways. We've found that chart reviews are a really great way to get comparable data across different countries. We do look at electronic medical record data. It's getting more sophisticated over time, but this is, I would say that's an area that's still evolving. We're trying to figure out the natural language processing, what we can use from that medical record data. Claims database analyses are pretty common. I'm sure many of you have heard of market scans, so using that data to look at cost or pharmacoepidemiology. Those are still typical studies being done. And finally, registry design and analysis. Sometimes we're able to set up these studies up front and continue to follow patients over time. So these are all analyses that can be done. All of those could be done pre-clinical trial. So a reason you might do it before the drug is even in phase 3 is you may need a historic control. You might want to understand the market and do a pre-launch chart review and a post-launch chart review. There may be gaps in the literature where you don't even know what the disease looks like and what disease progression looks like. So you just want that information. And then ultimately, when your drug gets on market, you want to understand, in the real world, are we seeing the same outcomes that we were seeing in the trials? And these are all things that, as HEOR researchers, we are able to do and we understand. For patient-reported outcomes and clinical outcomes assessment, this is probably the most this is a group that does a lot more before the drug is in clinical trials or during the clinical trial process. A lot of times we're supporting clients in creating a new measure in order to support a label claim. So this is a field, again, that's growing, refining, and this should be done phase 1, phase 2. They're setting up these studies and going, okay, well, we want to capture this symptom. It's only patient-reported. How do we frame those questions, and what questions do we need to ask to really be able to measure that in a reliable and repeatable way? There's also an aspect of doing the PRO analytics in the field too. A lot of measures are developed that aren't for label claims. So EQ5D, SF36, there are different purposes there. So if you're trying to get utilities for an economic model, those need to be based on data. So we need to help, sometimes we're designing the studies that are collecting the information on the patients. Other times we're designing studies and making sure or we're analyzing the data that already exists and looking for nuances or subgroups in that data. The field of patient-reported outcomes research is continually changing right now. So another thing that we provide is that regulatory advising of how do you actually interact with the FDA and EMEA. And then finally, PRO dossiers are a document that's in a more standardized format that can be used for an FDA submission to explain the validation process for a measure. And that's another area that, as HEOR researchers, if your proclivity is for patient-reported outcomes, it's good to understand these sort of documents. So with that, I was going to give an example of a real-world example of kind of different types of research we've done for a product, but maybe I can stop here and ask if there are any questions. Okay, then I'm going to have, you might have more when we get into real-world examples. So this was an example of a product that we were working on. We had a very early connection with a client. They moved to a new company, and they had actually connections with one of the partners of our company and wanted to make sure they were new on the job. They had just hired an HEOR, I believe at the time it was a HEOR manager, only HEOR person in the company, and he wanted to make sure we were doing things right. He didn't have the manpower, wanted to make sure everything was okay. So what he asked for us to do was do an HEOR landscape assessment, which would, in our company, fall kind of under strategic market access, and also really work with him on making sure that what was going to be measured in their clinical trials, which were about to kick off, making sure that they were including the right metrics for what they would ultimately need downstream. Now, they knew they might be going for a European focus. So, for example, we said you may want to include a utility measure so that you have measures for your cost effectiveness models. We also were looking for generic and disease-specific instruments, going into the psychometric properties, and really trying to define what was the best tools for that given study. Also taking into account the fact that this is a real-world study, right? So, it's a clinical trial, but someone has to complete these instruments. In an ideal world, we would say complete all the instruments, but there is a constraint of time. So weighing together what we would like as researchers with what is feasible. So we gave some recommendations, some were taken, some weren't, and ultimately, because of that good experience that he had with the recommendations, he asked us to be part of the process of the clinical trial. In terms of being able to review the protocol, making sure that the instruments were in the trial correctly, that they were even that they were being used correctly. For example, I didn't even realize that I had to say this, but in a kind of meeting that I was sitting in on one of the meetings with like the clinical trial staff, I was like, yeah, so those instruments should be given before. This was the intervention was something that had to do with an injection. I was like, yeah, you should probably give that before you give the drug or give the injection, because we're asking about pain, and if they just had an injection, they're probably going to answer differently than before the injection. And they're like, oh, well, then you need to put a subnote in the protocol that these need to be given before the injection. So things like that may even seem like common sense. Because I was able to be on that call and was in that circumstance, I was like, oh, okay, we need to add notes like that. So even just understanding simple principles of survey design and study design are factors that, as researchers, we can add to these study teams. So this study went on for a number of years. So as you can see, that was 2014, end of 2014 we were designing it. It really launched in 2015. There's a whole lot if you're trying to get an instrument on an ePro device. That's a trip. There's a big learning curve there and a lot of documentation that needs to be done. So that trial was a 6-month trial with a 6-month potential extension for a long-term safety trial. And then also there were patients who were enrolled 12 months in the safety trial. During the time the trial was going on, we were not resting on our laurels. We were developing information regarding the AMCP dossier. We were developing a budget impact model. And even that ended up dynamic because at first we were like, do you want a cost effectiveness model or do you want a budget impact model? Their answer was yes. And so we're like, great. They're like, we want everything, all the things, which is typical. We had to work with them on what are the differences between the two, how are they the same and different. Ultimately, at first, while he thought we wanted the same one, we ended up separating it into 2 separate initiatives, which ended up being the right move in this case. But we were developing that and refining it and updating it. As part of that, they realized they needed the information on cost, better information on cost of hospitalization, which led to a analysis of a claims database that ultimately was used to populate the budget impact model. We kind of toyed with the idea of a societal model of this condition. So instead of looking at just a provider perspective, trying to use a broader perspective. Ultimately, that was not feasible. But these were all things that we were doing as a clinical trial was going on. We developed an AMCP dossier, so summarizing both the clinical and economic evidence and kind of how the whole process went. And throughout that, we were making sure that we were not only looking at doing this research, but how is this going to be communicated? So making sure that we had publications, making sure that we were involving clinical experts and we knew what we were doing that way. So once the clinical trial finished, we also were able to negotiate with this client to get the data in-house, to be able to do, in addition to the planned analyses, do post hoc analyses to support publications, to support the model, to support varying efforts throughout the process. So that kind of fell in our real-world evidence group. And then finally, when we ended up, after the trial ended, one thing that was really kind of cool and unique is that we're following patients in a registry. So there was, by design, at the time the placebo-controlled trial was ending, there was funding in order to catch those patients as they were dropping out of the trial or completing the trial or going into the long-term trial and then following them after the trial for up to 24 months. So capturing, okay, well, what happened? So yes, you got great treatment, but are the outcomes that we observed there, are the positive effects continuing? Are there negative effects happening afterwards? What's going on? And that's been a really interesting effort because we're both collecting clinical information as well as patient-reported outcomes information in that process. So really you can see that this is not a one-year thing. This is something that I've personally been involved in. Really, I started in the 2013 time frame, so it's been over 5 years really seeing these interesting pieces, and it's continuing. We're still working on, we're about to get the 24-month data on this registry. We're also working on an idea of trying to integrate the data across these approaches and looking at novel ways of answering questions driven by a clinical panel. So these are initiatives that we are really trying to keep alive, but for the purpose of really understanding this condition a little bit better. So that's a little bit across like different areas of HEOR research. Are there any questions on that one? Yes.
Just so that we understand the
Sure.
role of what your company does versus this focus was on HEOR, right?
Yes.
But do you evaluate the actual clinical trial itself, Caitlyn, or how do you work with that company that might do that? Because this is the outcomes and HEOR component, which is only one part of the study, right?
Absolutely. So that was great. That's a great question, Simon. In terms of, so if you see a company that's traditionally called a contract research organization, those are the ones who do the trial. So they're the ones getting the drug, going through and really administrating the trial, making sure it's done. That's not what our company does. We are, as an HEOR company, my role was to provide advisory support. So to say, this is what you should include in the trial, define an HEOR-related SAP, so we did a separate SAP, statistical analysis plan, thank you, sorry, terms. Statistical analysis plan and table shelves, which are basically blank Excel tables that's like, this will be populated, this is what data I want you to give me. So we provide that data, we provide the information, the blank shelves to them. That company was populating those tables, and then we were getting them, summarizing them, putting together figures, interpreting it, doing the executive summaries on that. Now there are a lot of contract research organization companies that try to have an HEOR arm. In some cases it works really well, because there are a lot of resources that both can pull on. In some it doesn't work so well because the world of clinical trials is very regulated, and the world of health economics and outcomes research is sort of kind of most of the time regulated in it's regulated in a different way. So because of that, we have seen cases where there's culture clashes there, but we found that we are very happy to partner with a contract research organization to do the health economics research. But when it comes to actually collecting the data and being able to get the drug in-house, shipping it out, doing all of these long-term studies, that's something that takes a lot of manpower and a lot of force, and typically that doesn't fall in the HEOR realm of things. So there are a lot of partners that you can use to do that. Yes?
You were telling us that he did, we did.
Oh, who's we? Sure. Sure. When I say we, I mean my company. But typically, teams are structured in different ways. In this case, because I had really wonderful training at UIC, if I'm honest, that involved doing these different types of research, I was able to lead all but a few pieces. So AMCP.P is not my thing. So I partnered with so while I advised on that sort of project, typically project teams at our consulting company, and I think a lot of others, involve an analyst. So if it's a data analysis project, it's someone who's going to do the SAS data. If it doesn't involve data analysis, analysts typically, this can be masters, senior analysts can be entry-level PhDs. They're going to do the first pass on slides. They're going to draft deliverables. Then typically we have a scientist. So the scientist is the one who's doing the conceptualization. They're saying, this is the way you do the study. At our company, we tend to, new PhDs, it's usually a PhD with 1 to 2 years of experience in consulting, who'll be like, yes, this is the way we should do it, who are signing off on what the analyst does, or in many cases, drafting the first draft themselves. We have a project director. They're typically the ones who have who have more consulting experience, and who they're really managing that relationship with the client. They also have to do a lot of the paperwork side of things, so they're having to do the budgets, make sure we're meeting the timelines, and really are managing that relationship. So when I'm saying we, it's a team that's kind of made up of those levels, and then you might have a project officer who's kind of the person who comes in. If something's going wrong, they'll swoop in, help, and then kind of swoop back out again, depending on which project officer it is. So in terms of this, it's not one person. It's very much not one person. It's a team of people, and that same team, so for example, for the things in real-world evidence, data analytics, and PRO, it was mostly the same team who were doing those bottom 2 rows. For the modeling and meta-analysis, the scientists on those were all the same. And for strategic market access, that was 3 different directors, and there were a couple analysts who walked across. But really one thing that we find, and one reason this is a really great question, is one thing that we found at Pharmerit is the best project teams are the ones that can kind of go across and make sure they have that knowledge and can cross the boundaries here. That multidimensionality is really, really helpful. But also we really need the specialists too. Are there any other questions? Okay, okay. I think I have time for the next case study. So really, this is the one, I really wanted to go a little bit, dive deeper on one particular project and talk about the implications that came out of that. So this was a pan-European chart review and physician survey in 12 countries listed here. And this was a study that was developed for a antibiotic that is available in oral form in a class of antibiotics that only had IV therapies. So the advantage there of this medication is that for patients who really are only in the hospital because they need the IV, they may be able to be discharged earlier, which ultimately could be associated with a cost savings. So really we're trying to understand what is the unmet need and potential cost savings for early switch, early discharge programs. So in order to do that, sometimes in an ideal situation, this would be a prospective trial where there would be an intervention there and we would be able to see the impact. In the real world, a lot of times there are kind of budget constraints going on. So as we were brainstorming with the client and giving them different price points, where the study landed was that we were going to do a retrospective, non-interventional medical chart review. So use a chart review design to try to figure out what could be, if patients could be switched earlier or discharged earlier. Ultimately, we ended up with 342 physicians and 1,542 patients with MRSA-confirmed clinical or complicated skin and soft tissue infections. You will note that I kind of close my eyes when I talk about these clinical things. I am a methodologist. Speaking of teams, I'm a methodologist. The best teams have people who have clinical expertise and methodological expertise. You're not going to find it all in one person. So if there are any clinical questions, I will probably give you the contact information for the clinical team members. So in terms of when we say early switch, early discharge, one of the biggest challenges in the study was, what does that mean? Like, how do you define or find a patient who could be switched from an IV therapy to an oral? What does that take? The way that we went about this is there was an advisory panel pulled together with clinical experts from each of these countries. It was actually really cool. And there were 2 from each country, and from there were a number of physicians who were speaking up a lot, but 3 that were super active, and actually, so 2 physicians, 1 pharmacist, so plug for pharmacists here, who were really, really active and really giving a lot of insight on what was important in terms of understanding what these switch protocols were. We asked them if they'd be willing to further serve as our kind of study panel. So we have these 3 clinical experts who really helped us throughout the process. And I feel like that was a very strong piece of this project. And based on the expert panel and then a lot of debriefing afterwards, what we came to is that early switch would be defined as patients who had stable clinical infection, they weren't running a fever, they had their white cell count normalizing, no unexplained tachycardia, their blood pressure was fine, and that they could tolerate oral fluids and diet. Because ultimately, if this is an oral treatment, you need to be able to take things orally. And then when we were thinking about oral discharge or early discharge, there were a number of criteria we were looking at, but ultimately at the end of the day, we realized that why don't we keep it simple? No other reason to be in the hospital except for your IV treatment or except for the infection. So ultimately, we developed a lot of different forms so we developed forms in order to collect the data, and ultimately found in certain countries, they don't collect a lot of information that we needed. So we had to do a lot of refining and going back and forth and repiloting instruments. And this study design, going back a little bit to the study design, the way that these charts were being reviewed is standardized forms were developed. We contacted clinicians who served as study investigators. They or their staff abstracted this data and then reported it back to us. So we were not sending staff members there to collect the data. They were collecting the data, entering it into an online system, and then we were able to subsequently analyze it. Now, the interesting thing about this study, early switch and early discharge. So we needed to know, so we had to ask questions about, did the patient meet these criteria? But one interesting piece of it was asking them, okay, if they met that criteria, could they have met it earlier? And that really, the could they have met it earlier became the basis of this early switch definition. So how much earlier could the patient have met all of these criteria? So ultimately what we found is across all of the countries, 37.9% of these MRSA CFSTI patients met early discharge criteria, and among those 37.9% of patients, they could have left the hospital. So again, Europe, they have long hospital stays. So on average, the actual length of hospitalization was 20.8 days. But based on the responses that we got in these case report forms, what was reported is that those patients met all of those criteria by a mean of 14.6 days. So we could have had an average of 6.2 bed days less if that patient was switched from IV to oral. We also were able to capture a very small, so this was a drug that was used sometime. We were able to capture a very small piece of people who are IV to oral switched, so who actually had this happen. And sample sizes were low, but we saw a trend in a similar direction, that patients who were able to switch from IV to oral did have shorter hospital stays, which for us gave us a little bit more confidence that what we were seeing was indeed the case. Then we used an external source for understanding what the number of bed days so we used a World Health Organization source that gives the cost per bed day, and said, okay, if it's 345 euros per day, multiply that by the difference, which is 6.2, in order to understand what is the cost savings that could what's the cost savings that could be realized if patients were discharged earlier. Now, it's great I'm going to skip this for time. So it's great to understand that on a broad scale for the entire European area, but really what was very important is kind of breaking it also down on the country scale, because each country had an interest in this data. Because there was so much data, we did end up publishing it in 8 separate publications. But really, that's not where the story ended. Because that data was so descriptively rich, we realized that in order to really understand it and interpret it, we needed to make dynamic tools to make that data really live past the publication and make it something that could be interpreted. So a number of things this data was used in a number of different ways. So we did the scientific presentations paper and did a whole journal supplement. We used the data to inform the parameters and cost effectiveness models across Europe. It was adapted and it was used in a number of HTA submissions, and it was also used in a global nosocomial pneumonia model, and was used in the global value dossier. But in order to make that data, and here are 2 of the publications. And one thing I wanted to show you guys is we did make a very interesting graphic user interface to kind of summarize this information. So this is the data that I shared with you before. So 37.9 of patients could be discharged 6.2 days earlier. And what's been built is a real summary of this information across the different conditions, where you can toggle to the Czech Republic, for example, and see what this data looks like. And the reason why I really wanted to show you this is it doesn't have to die in 10,000 tables. We really need to think about, as HEOR researchers, we generate a lot of data. How can we make this data speak to an audience? This is something that I really love and love doing. So that's something I found. So I had given a very preliminary, very ugly version of this to the client at one point, and I'm so excited that we're finally getting to this point that it's becoming an actual tool that's used. But really, one thing that I've learned in consulting is it's not just about getting that publication, it's about how do we develop it in slides, in dashboards, in other ways to make sure that this information is shared. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, we had this advisory panel. One brilliant thing that this client did is they set it up such that that same advisory panel, as we were doing the preliminary data readouts, We brought them back. We brought them to Vienna, Austria. And everyone sat in a room together and got to see these results live, comment on it, understand what was going on, and ultimately take it back to their countries and be able to be some of the spokespeople to say, hey, I was part of this study, here are the results, and this is why it's important. Now, I will admit I stopped, so I was focused on the chart review, speaking of different teams. I understand that since then, this has also been used in promoting antibiotics stewardship initiatives worldwide, and that we've been able to be involved in those initiatives. Yes?
So were you able to follow up patients who switched to oral antibiotics if they were like adherent to it, they were actually taking it? Because most patients have this thinking that, okay, like I'm discharged now, I'm feeling better, so I may just like stop my antibiotics.
Right, and that's a great question. So a lot of this study was retrospective. For the few patients that were IV to oral switch, unfortunately, a limitation of the data was that it stopped in the hospitalization. This study was focused on just the hospitalization. So other studies do go in hospitalization and external. It was just not the point of this particular initiative. All right, I want to be sensitive to time, so I'm going to end it now. So I just wanted to show another thing that we did is, it was actually interesting. Another researcher who wasn't part of this looked at our abstract and was like, well, you know that could be simplified into one simple graphic. And it was kind of cool. So this was a graphic that she put together based on that as kind of an exercise for one of our marketing people. But I just wanted to show you guys it's another way that you can really make the data. It's not just about saying the message, but it's about making it simple enough that an audience understands it. So with that, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate it. Are there any closing questions anyone has? Yes.
You talked a little bit about how you guys like value innovation. I'm just wondering from your perspective how receptive industry is to that. Because sometimes you see a lot of this, like they're just not really interested in going outside the box to some extent. So like, do you guys? And I'm sure you like respond to RFPs or like whatever. Like, and I mean, do you guys push that a little or?
That's a great question. It depends on the relationship. I would say for the vast majority of our projects, where we get to do the innovative work is after we have 1 to 2 years relationship with that client. So we say, yeah, we did that traditional way, but have you ever considered this other thing? Or they're a little more receptive when the results they got were negative. If we can say, well, let us try this thing because we think that that's a better model. Pragmatically, there's a little bit more receptivity there, but if I'm responding to a request for proposal and it's like blind, oh no, that's not the time for innovation. You can list it as an optional task, and maybe you have maybe the person who reviews it at the company will go, oh, I'm really interested in that other thing. But in terms of just if it's someone I don't have a relationship with, the furthest I push that is an optional item for them. So yeah, there is a little risk aversion to innovation that way. We also try to fund things internally, and if we know that it's something that we want to do to push the boundaries and that we want to present at ISPOR and do a workshop and that eventually could lead to business, we will also pursue that as well. Yes?
Well, Caitlyn, that was a wonderful overview of how a lot of the things you guys are learning right now directly relate to. So